Before we begin developing our skills on how to write a comparative essay, a DBQ, and a CCOT essay, we need to first master how to write a thesis. How to write an AP World History thesis. Because if you look at the rubric here for the comparative essay, the very first point you can receive is, do you have an acceptable thesis? What does that mean, acceptable thesis? It's worth 1 point, but really, if you don't have a thesis that's appropriate in your paper, the odds of you having the necessary data or the correct data to receive the other points drops significantly. The thesis is the spine of your paper. It gives it direction and lets the reader know what they'll be reading about. So it's very important that you master this ability and can use your great thesis writing skills on all of your essays. For our discussion, we'll be looking at a prompt that's for a comparative essay. All you need to know about the comparative essay to understand the thesis is that in a comparative essay, you'll be given 2 or more items, places, or things, and you'll be asked to answer how those 2 items are similar and different. You have to do both. It's how they're the same and how they are different. You need to make sure you're answering what the question is asking you. If it's asked you to answer how they are similar and different through religion, you need to find similarities and differences about religion, not about items that aren't related to religion. So for our prompt here, we're comparing and contrasting the use of trade in 2 of the following regions during the time periods mentioned. We have China during both the Qin and the Han dynasties. We have the Roman Empire in the Mediterranean. We have Mesoamerica with the Mayans, and we have South America with the Inca. Typically, they'll give you the name of the empire or political state, and they'll give you the years rather than the geographic region. Okay, so that's our prompt. We'll come back to it later. When writing a thesis, the whole point of a thesis for AP World History is the same as for any other thesis you ever written. You are answering the prompt for the question that's given to you concisely as you can and accurately as you can so that the reader knows you know what you're talking about, and you're laying out a roadmap so they know what they'll be reading about and how you have broken down your arguments and your thoughts, and they can then tackle it when it comes to greater detail for that knowledge. So you're really just making a roadmap, and you're trying to write that as concisely as possible with appropriate vocabulary, and you want to be clear and accurate. As mentioned earlier, it gives structure to your essay. It's the spine. It lets the reader know what you're trying to do. When I was your age, I thought, I like to kind of be sneaky about my thesis. I want people to read my paper and realize as they're reading it what they're reading about and kind of put together as they're reading it. That's not good. You should tell us what you'll be talking about immediately. Immediately what you'll be talking about in your introductory paragraph so that we have a clue what you're talking about, so we're better able to find the points that you're trying to make and understand the argument that you're making as well. It also sets the tone for what you're going to be talking about. The most important piece of a thesis is that it answers the question. If you get asked a question about, again, let's say trade between these 2 different dynasties, you better talk about trade, and you should not be talking about social structures or religious deities if it's not related to trade. Okay? And if it's not directly related, you need to make it clear how it is related in your thesis. When you are writing your thesis, use specific terms. Avoid saying things like stuff and many and often. You want to use words that specifically explain how many times things happen. It happened annually. It happened yearly. They didn't trade stuff. They traded textiles, or they traded goods created by merchants, or they traded natural resources or spices or agricultural crops. It doesn't need to be a list of every single specific thing, but it does need to be clear what you're talking about. You can't say things like, we traded stuff, or we traded items, or they both like to travel. That's not appropriate. It needs to be more specific than that. Each thesis is going to have a verb. It's what it's asking you to do. I want you to compare and contrast. I want you to analyze. I want you to look for or identify, So you gotta see what that verb is, and then make sure you actually do it. The worst thing you could do is get asked a question where it wants you to compare and contrast something, and you spend the whole time just identifying aspects of these two societies, rather than talking about how the societies are similar and different. So look for the verb. It's pretty clear most of the time, and then do what it asks you to do. Don't do whatever you want to do. Do what it asks you to do. Your thesis for the AP exam can either be in the opening paragraph or the closing paragraph. It's typically like one of the last sentences of the opening paragraph. You should put yours in the opening paragraph. Again, don't make it a mystery. Tell us being the reader, exactly what you're going to be talking about as soon as possible. Put it in your first paragraph and make it clear what you're going to be talking about. And you can restate it again in your closing paragraph. Before our class, even if the option of doing both, I want you to do the opening paragraph. So do the opening paragraph. With your thesis, you typically want to have context provided. When I grade your guys' essay test, I will expect you to have context, meaning you will be supplying information about who you were talking about, where the thing or what the things you were talking about existed, and when they existed. It's important that you do that because it kind of sets the tone for the paper and also shows you know what you're talking about. You see the bigger picture. And one of the odd things about the thesis that is different than your typical thesis is that usually when I was taught thesis at your age, and I assume you're learning the same thing now in English class, and this is accurate, that it should be one sentence and fairly concise. Get to the point, don't ramble on. For the AP World History exam, you are allowed to have multiple sentences make up your thesis. Meaning you could have 2 to 3 sentences that are all part of your thesis. The catch is they must be in a row. So if you have multiple sentences, you have more than one sentence that makes up your thesis, because you have so much you want to say about your main point, they must be consecutive sentences. You can't have a sentence about your thesis, then your next sentence be completely random, and then go back to your thesis, because then you've broken your thesis in half, and then it's no longer an acceptable thesis. So you can have multiple sentences, but they must be in a row, consecutive. And you also have the ability to write more. They give you a little bit of leeway in the AP exam, like where if you put more details than are necessary, they're not going to take points away. They'll still give you the appropriate score, a good score, as long as what you're saying is accurate. It has to be accurate, and it's relevant to the topic. So you're saying things that are true, and you are answering the prompt. And you're doing so in one sentence, or you're doing it in multiple sentences that are consecutive. I teach you that because you should know how they grade it, but don't let that throw you off. Those oddities I just told you at the end about the multiple sentences and the length of it. You're doing the same thing you always do in any thesis. You're answering the prompt. So just answer the prompt. Just a checklist for you. This is a checklist for a comparative thesis, and this is the different components of it. For this essay, we're looking for our examples, and if they're good or not. So we're going to see a list of different theses for the prompt we looked at earlier, and we're going to discuss if they are worthy enough of being deemed an appropriate thesis, meaning there's enough content, that it's specific enough and it's accurate enough, yet it meets the requirements for the essay. We're going to be checking that. For this essay, they must have a similarity and a difference identified in the thesis. They must be clear what they're going to be talking about, and they should be saying who they are talking about, and ideally, maybe they said where and when. But we're looking really for a similarity and a difference, and that they're answering the specific point of the question. Let's go back to the question. Compare and contrast. We want to find similarity and difference. The use of trade. They must be talking about the use of trade. They are focusing on this. So they're finding a similarity and a difference about the use of trade between two of these options here. One more component about the thesis. If they ask you for 2, only talk about 2. Don't talk about 4 or 3 or just 1. Talk about 2. If they ask you to do 2, only do 2. If you do more than 2, you're not answering the prompt. You're going rogue and you're doing your own thing. So, we look at these prompts, we're going to see our responses to the prompt. Is there similarity and difference mentioned? And are they similarities and differences about trade for 2 of these options here? Alright, let's go check them out. Also, watch out for generalities and appropriate grammar. But we're looking for, again, are they answering the prompt? Particularly, are they saying a similarity and a difference? And are they talking about trade? Are they talking about trade? There's our prompt again. First one. In Mayan culture, the elites used a form of hieroglyphic writing to keep records, while elites in the Inca society used a complex method of knot tying called quipu to keep records. 3, 2, 1. This is a poor thesis because it discusses technology, does not discuss how technology impacted trade, and doesn't talk about any other components of trade. Yes, they talk about only 2 of our options, but they don't answer the prompt. They talk about technology and not trade. They could tie the technology, talk about how keeping records helps with trade and accounting for numbers, but they don't. They don't. At least barely they do. They could be more direct. The other big problem is that they don't identify similarity. They just state that they use different types of writing systems, record-keeping systems, for recording their data. They don't say how they're similar. So it only answers part of the prompt. It does not fully answer the prompt. You could say that they answer this technology that tied into trade because it talks about keeping records, but really the bigger problem is that they only talk about a similarity and not a similarity. Sorry, they only talk about a difference and not a difference and a similarity. Our second one. The greatest similarity between the Han and Roman empires was that they both were linked by the Silk Road and both used the structures of empire to support transportation projects that made trade more accessible. The greatest differences was the types of products and crafts traded and manufactured by each civilization. It's a good thesis. Instead of saying stuff and trying to avoid the words made as often as possible, I use a wider vocabulary. I mention a difference and a similarity. It's very clear who I'm talking about, and there's multiple similarities provided for this, so more than just one. It's clear, it's long, it's more than one sentence, but it's appropriate. I would say this though, I would avoid putting things like the greatest. Don't prioritize your points. They're all good points. Just make your points. Okay? Because this might not be the greatest similarity between the two. It's a debatable topic. So don't necessarily put yourself in a corner by saying things like that. But this is a good thesis. This is a great thesis. Trade dynamics in the Roman Empire centered around the Mediterranean Sea. In China, however, they used rivers for trade. Both societies used the Silk Road and water routes to transport goods throughout their empires and to their neighbors. 3, 2, 1. This again is a good thesis. Let's look at it. Talks about trade dynamics. The Roman centered around Mediterranean, and China they use rivers for trade. So they use different ways of transporting the goods for trade. That's a difference. But both societies use the Silk Road and water routes to transport goods throughout their empires. The water routes kind of is hitting on it's kind of piggybacking off the difference, which isn't great. But the identification of them both using the Silk Road is an excellent similarity to make. That is different. So this is a good one. It's not as detailed as the last one. The vocabulary could be better, but this is an appropriate thesis to get the point because it's a similarity and a difference, and it's clear what they are. 2 more. In both the Mayan and the Inca societies, trade occurred mostly within their empire by land. For the Chinese and Roman societies, trade occurred by land with the Silk Road, but also by water. This is not, let's get to it, it's a poor thesis. It uses all 4 of the areas instead of just 2. So it talks about 4 different empires and societies rather than just 2 like it asked you. So it doesn't answer the prompt. And it's hard to stay focused like this because now it's all over the place rather than just focusing on 2 groups. In our last thesis, both the Han Dynasty and the Roman Empire traded goods. However, each dynasty traded different stuff. This is awful. There's not specific or clear, and you need to use your vocabulary. Stuff? Honestly, stuff? If I see that essay, you're just not going to get the point, and you're going to get a big mark on there for putting that there. Stuff. You can do better. Goods. What's a good? Use your terms. They traded textiles. They traded agricultural products. Be more specific. You don't need to spell it out and name all the types of crops they traded, but use your vocabulary to specify. It's important with this writing a thesis that you always answer the prompt. We'll talk more about this in class.